It was 9:23 a.m. when an envelope slid across my mahogany desk and changed the afternoon I had planned. White, heavy stock, Brennan Associates stamped in navy on the flap. For a second, I let it sit there, ridiculous as it sounds, like a paperweight with a pulse. My assistant, Rebecca, cleared her throat at the doorway and then closed it without waiting. No one in the office knew the backstory that came with that name. To most people, it was a Midwest boutique with stubborn good clients and an even more stubborn reputation. To me, it was my father. You don't need me to tell you the irony. My professional signature is Morrison. It's my mother's maiden name, the one I adopted when I made partner and decided I wanted to be judged on the work I did, not the last name on my birth certificate. It was a deliberate choice, an unremarkable administrative act at the time that felt like claiming something private in the public world of law. I signed my emails Catherine Morrison. I put Morrison and Whitley on our client pitches. I built a career where people expected competence first and pedigree second. Yet there, in navy ink, was Brennan Associates, asking to sit at our table. If you want the full story of what happened in that boardroom, how a partnership proposal turned into something none of us expected, stay with me. I was careful in my reply. We don't let anything slip through at Morrison and Whitley. Risk appetite, client conflicts, overlap in practice areas. Everything goes across my desk. The envelope contained a crisp 6-page memo, a proposal for a local partnership, a straightforward ask to combine certain practices, and an attached overview of their books. I had the advantage of time and an ingrained suspicion. I read the cover note once, twice, then called for a formal presentation. The presentation day was clinical. I remember small details because I catalog them in my head now, the way other people catalog photographs. The conference room was cold, the light from the windows slicing the skyline into neat shards. There were 6 of their partners seated opposite our team, their folders on their laps, Thomas Mitchell in the center with his hands folded like a man who practiced patience as a personal discipline. Robert Brennan sat on the far end, quieter than I expected. Marcus, my brother, gave me a look that had nothing to do with corporate combinations and everything to do with childhood. We ran through the numbers the way we always do: revenue trends, client attrition, partner leverage, aging ownership. Their revenues had declined, not precipitously, but steadily over 3 years. A handful of good clients remained, loyal to relationships more than structures, but new business had dried up. Overhead was lean out of necessity. Their associates wore more hats than their partners probably remembered being comfortable with years ago. Their succession plan, if you could call it that, was a patchwork of hope and implied trust. It read, to my trained eye, like an organization built on reputations and personal relationships, not systems. In plain terms, they were a valuable franchise that had lost velocity. To a large, organized firm like ours, that presented an opportunity. Faster market entry into Chicago. A book of business that, with the right stewardship, could be stabilized. Talented associates we could retain and elevate. Cost-effective expansion versus the slow burn of opening a new office. This is the kind of puzzle we solve for clients. Our job was to see the math and the people simultaneously. So I asked the obvious questions. How much of the revenue was repeat litigation versus one-off mandates? Who were the rainmakers, and what did their relationships look like? What was their associate pipeline? Is there any pending liability? I pressed on fees, on client concentration, on replacement costs. My tone was professional and, I like to think, fair. I'm not in the business of raising things for sport. But then, I asked the one question no one in the room wanted to hear. Who is leading this negotiation from your side? Eyes dropped to notepads. Thomas spoke carefully. He had the right instincts about the business, always the diplomat. He named names in the bland way senior lawyers do, and then, as if he just remembered a scheduling conflict, he added, "Robert will be here." No one in our room moved. My chest tightened the way it had when I was 10, and heard my father's voice from the kitchen accusing me, loud and clear, of failing before I had a chance to try. The boardroom became 2 rooms at once, the present one with overhead projectors and beautifully printed slides, and an old sunburned backyard where my father liked to hold court and hand out verdicts about me before I had earned them. When he stood, he was smaller than I remembered, not because he had lost weight, but because the posture of being a founder doesn't always travel well into the decade of retirement. He offered a handshake that was polite, formal, and then, when he spoke, it was softer than the Brennan I knew. He apologized. This is the word that sits in my memory like a bruise that refuses to fade. He didn't file for absolution. He didn't call me names. He said something that, to the untrained ear, may have sounded like concession. To me, it sounded like acknowledgement. It was awkward. It was human. But the meeting was not about our family. It was about risk, synergies, and strategy. I told them then, calmly, professionally, that a partnership model, as they proposed, would not protect the clients or the associates. A partnership where they kept autonomy would leave key relationships dependent on aging partners. It would not address their pipeline problem. It would also create governance tension. On a legal and fiduciary level, the safer course for our clients and for their people was an acquisition with a clear transition plan. He looked at me as if he'd been struck by a fact that had nothing to do with the narrative he'd told himself about my life. "You'll never be a real lawyer," had been the phrase that followed most of my childhood achievements. Sometimes it was said with a chuckle at a family barbecue. Sometimes it was dropped in passages where my confidence was fragile and my ambitions visible. It was never delivered as a malediction, more like a prophecy meant to guide me back into place. I had worn it like a shadow for years. I didn't say it aloud in that room. I don't remember when the recoil stopped being shock and started being arithmetic. Business is a refuge because it has rules, and in that room I invoked those rules. "We can do this," I told them, "but not as a partnership. If you're serious about protecting the people who still answer your phones when clients call, if you're serious about preserving the legal relationships that matter, then you should consider a sale." When I outlined what that would look like at a high level: purchase of the firm, retention agreements for the associates, an advisory role for senior partners to ensure client continuity. There was a silence after that. It was not the kind that waits for applause. It was the kind that waits for a response that will, in some way, decide who keeps a job and who loses a name. In offices, decisions like this land with an almost physical weight. We recessed and I walked out of the room to thin air and the hum of elevators. The team around me was against the partnership model. Risk analysis had a way of compressing people toward the most pragmatic choice. Yet, as the meeting closed, something personal lodged in me. A decision made in the public workspace would echo into a private life I'd been nursing with very particular care. I told myself on the walk back to my office that I had done my duty. I had been prudent. I had been fair. The firm had to be protected. The clients had to be protected. That's when Rebecca slid into my office with what she thought would be a helpful update: mentions of downstream impacts, potential integration costs, the logistics of moving a team into our Chicago suite. And I noticed I was not listening. My thoughts had tunneled back to the backyard again, to the way my father could reduce entire years of my work into a single sentence. There are moments when a professional decision carries a personal signature. I had tried to remove mine. My instincts told me to close the file, archive it, and let others manage the next steps. I signed the minutes we used to document why a partnership was not viable. I told the partners we'd revisit if they brought a better plan. Then I went home. 1 week later, the file was back on my desk. We had company protocols for offers that required escalation. When a deal had both commercial and reputational complexity, we escalated to the executive committee. The memo that returned was thinner, but the implication was heavier. Thomas had called to say the partners wanted us to reconsider an acquisition. They'd think about selling, he said, if we could show a commitment that would preserve legacies and steward clients well. He assured us they were realistic about the firm's situation. Marcus sent a brief email, too formal to be sincere, asking for time to call me. That time arrived as a Saturday appointment at a small cafe on the Chicago Riverwalk. He said it was his idea. I suspected it was at my father's urging. The week in between had a shape. I scheduled calls. I mobilized a team to do a light diligence sweep. Nothing formal, just a preliminary run to quantify what we'd already observed. We called their top 3 clients, discreetly, to sense whether those relationships were transactional or tethered to individual partners. We reviewed their balance sheets more carefully, checked their contingent liabilities, scanned files for conflicts. The headline: they had structural value and operational risk. The associates were hungry, experienced beyond what their title suggested, and clearly loyal. The client portfolios were concentrated but deep. This is where the calculus changes. If you buy a firm, you don't just buy numbers. You buy people, culture, and expectation. A partnership proposal had been a messy middle ground where legacy partners might have thought they could keep the steering wheel while handing us the map. A full acquisition gave us control to implement systems, to invest in business development, and to make targeted promotions that would stabilize morale. It also allowed us to design a transition strategy that didn't humiliate anyone publicly, an honor we owed to clients who still trusted certain faces at Brennan Associates. I did the thing I always do when the stakes are both professional and personal. I drew a plan on a single legal pad. At the top, acquisition rationale. Bullet points flowed: market entry Chicago, retention of client books, acceleration versus organic growth, talent retention, cost efficiency. Below that, I sketched a transition model: 2-year advisory agreement for senior partners, retention bonuses for key associates, 3 promotions to partner to solidify career paths, a 60-day target for close once terms are accepted to minimize market uncertainty. I wrote the number at the bottom, $15 million, because numbers reduce the room for melodrama. It's a figure that would both reflect fair value for a mid-market firm with loyal clients and be achievable within our financing parameters without writing an implausible check. It was the right enough number. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about doing the right thing for clients and people. And I took that pad to the committee. I explained, in the same calm register I had used in the boardroom, why acquisition, not partnership, was the cleaner, more responsible business solution. I talked about the associate promotions because real people rely on those promises. I talked about the advisory period because client continuity matters more than short-term optics. I argued that we were not rescuing a failing brand for vanity. We were buying a platform that allowed our firm to expand responsibly into a market we had identified as strategic. There were objections, of course. Someone pointed out the optics of buying a competitor tied to my own family. Someone else mentioned the risk of perceived nepotism if we promoted associates who had worked under my brother. I answered them as I always do, with process, due diligence, clear governance, compensated advisory roles that would have specific deliverables, firewalls where necessary. We agreed on a protocol. No single person would make the call. We would follow our own acquisition playbook. If the deal moved forward, it would do so under the same rules we cast across every other commercial decision. That night, I could not sleep. Part of it was the practical. My inbox had notes from private clients, questions about coverage during integration, a calendar that now included calls for due diligence teams. Part of it was different. The personal tug of handling a family legacy that had been, for decades, both my professional foil and an unresolved love story. I kept thinking about my mother, the woman whose name I use for my business card. She cheered me on in ways my father never did. Choosing Morrison as my professional identity had been both an act of independence and of homage. It never stopped being complicated. On Saturday morning, the river walk was brisk. I sat across from Robert at a table with a view of iron bridges and flat water. He arrived with a stack of notes, and that look of guarded hope that men of his generation often mistake for strength. Our conversation started with business, repetition of the things we had already said in 1,000 forms, numbers, clients, the future. But then, as the cup warmed its rim between our hands, his tone shifted. He talked about legacy in a way that wasn't about ego. He admitted vulnerability the way elderly men do when they sense the horizon moving against them. He asked, almost as an afterthought, if I would consider not just a deal, but oversight. He wanted assurances that people would be cared for. I remember the sun catching his hair and thinking, weirdly, about family photographs that had folded into history. I also remember the steady coldness in me that has been a companion for decades, a skepticism towards every soft word until it's threaded into a concrete plan. Business, in the end, is the language I trust to translate sentiment into action. So I laid out the offer. Not theatrically, we are lawyers, not actors. $15 million purchase price, contingent on standard representations and warranties. A 2-year advisory period for senior partners that included defined weeks of client introductions, retention packages tiered for associates, and 3 promotions to partner upon successful, close to reinforce the message that the people who stayed would have a future. I told him, frankly, that we would target a 60-day close once terms were accepted to limit market churn. I told him what was not negotiable: transparency in client lists, no last-minute surprises on liabilities, and a transition plan that would be public and dignified. He sounded tired when he accepted the general contours. He said he had to take it to the partners. He asked, in a voice that could have been an apology or a question, if we could keep this off the front pages. I promised discretion. He left with folded hands. I walked back to the office and tried to maintain a steady gait, as if the weight in my chest could be held in place by posture alone. There is an odd dissonance in offering to buy the thing that once belittled you. It feels both like righting a wrong and like seizing an inheritance that never really belonged to you. I reminded myself repeatedly that this was not personal posture. Our memo emphasized preservation of clients, of careers, of a local name that meant something to the city, even if the leadership had been slow to change. I believed it. I still do. The rest of the week was a blur of lists. Rebecca organized calls. I delegated tasks with the clarity of someone building scaffolding rather than a monument. We scheduled a formal due diligence kickoff contingent on their verbal acceptance. Thomas reached out to set up a partners meeting. Marcus texted a photograph of my father's shoes on the edge of the step, an absurd image, but one that felt private and human. In the background, the firm buzzed with its own life, unaware of the full extent of my personal calculus. There was a moment, late on the second night, when I folded the offer into an envelope, not because anyone needed a physical copy, but because I needed a tactile object to hold on to the plan we had laid. I wrote the closing timeline at the top. If they accepted Monday, we would aim to close in 60 days. I circled May 28, 2024, because dates turn plans into commitments. I put the 3 associate promotions in bold, because promises without names feel like potential betrayals. I left space for signatures, and left the envelope on my desk with the light of the city catching the fold. When the partners finally called, on a Monday that felt both unremarkable and pivotal, they said they had discussed it and would present the offer to their group. They spoke with the practiced cadence of men and women who have long made decisions behind closed doors. They asked for a couple of clarifications and a postponement to convene the firm. I told them what I'd told myself all week. We were prepared to move quickly, but we would not forego proper process. We put in a tentative window for the close and made clear we needed a public transition plan for the clients. Then, on that Monday, which had felt like a series of smaller Mondays stacked together, I received the call. They were unanimous. The words were simple, efficient. They had met and voted. They were ready to accept our offer and to begin the transition. I felt a strange mix of relief and grief, like someone who had finally crossed a difficult terrain, but who knew the view ahead would not be entirely untroubled. We set the mechanics in motion. Legal teams exchanged non-disclosure agreements, a preliminary purchase agreement was drafted, and a calendar for the 2-year advisory period started to take shape. We defined deliverables for senior partners, client introductions, key matter warm handoffs, commitments to certain industry events. The 3 associates we planned to promote were informed of our intent, though their promotions would remain contingent on the closing and performance metrics we all agreed upon. We agreed to keep a public face to the transaction that respected Brennan Associates' history while signaling the structural change necessary for sustainability. In quieter moments, my father called. Our conversations moved from spreadsheets to small, odd confessions. A story about a sneeze during a hearing 30 years prior. An admission that he had always loved the smell of law books. There was an awkward tenderness in these calls, like 2 people learning the grammar of civility for the first time. The acquisition had been framed as a business solution the day we proposed it. It was still a business solution. But as weeks turned into schedules and drafts into signatures, the personal thread wound through the work. Purchasing a firm with your father's name attached is not the theatrical coup it's sometimes imagined to be. It is instead a messy operation that requires tact, structure, and the willingness to accept that people, clients, associates, senior partners, and family will feel seen in different dimensions. We moved toward closing with a deliberate legal precision, my inbox filled with red lines. Our finance team finalized the cash allocation. The communications department drafted a press release that struck the balance between respectful acknowledgement of Brennan's history and our forward-looking integration plan. We prepared for the optics of a retirement party, a public night meant to honor a legacy while we quietly signaled the transition. I kept thinking about the old phrase, "You are not defined by what someone else said you were." It is both a comforting thought and a complicated one. Proving someone wrong feels at once trivial and monumental. I had spent a lifetime crafting an identity that would not be subject to the casual dismissal of a man who loved authority more than nuance. Yet here I was, negotiating a price for the firm that carried his name. It did not feel like triumph so much as stewardship. The night before the partners were due to sign off on the formal purchase agreement, I sat alone in my office, watching the lights of the city. In my hands was a simple program we had drafted for the transition: timelines, retention metrics, client contacts, and the mentorship schedule that would define the 2-year advisory role we had asked for. I reviewed the promises we had made to the 3 associates we hoped to elevate: training budgets, client portfolios, salaried increases contingent on hitting integration milestones. I believed then, and I believe now, that these were the right calls for the health of the practice and for the careers of young lawyers who deserved more than promises washed away by poor integration. At 8:07 the next morning, the Partners' Council emailed an acceptance. They would sign, they wrote, provided the final edits were made to the advisory language and the client consent letters were in place. The timeline was tight but plausible. If all parties acted with the discipline we had asked for, the close would target May 28, 2024. It felt astonishing to see a date printed like that. May 28th circled in my calendar with a small note. Close target. Promotions effective upon close. There is a peculiar quiet when the deal mechanics take over. Personal conversations continue on a different axis. Awkward dinners with my father, terse check-ins with Marcus, Rebecca checking the logistics of travel for associates who would be relocating, but the engine hums on, a series of procedural tasks that have the power to heal or to harm depending on how we do them. I will not pretend it felt like vindication in the way revenge looks in films. It felt pragmatic. It felt necessary. It felt, at times, like a public correction of a private ledger. I had been told, in small and cutting ways for years, that I would never be a real lawyer. My response was not to shout back, but to build systems that made that bar low and then raise it. Buying Brennan Associates was not a boast. It was a set of commitments to clients who deserved continuity, to associates who deserved career trajectories, and yes, to a man who had once told me I wouldn't belong. On my legal pad, beneath the $15 million figure and the circled May date, I wrote a final small line: hold dignity in public, keep promises private. It was both a reminder and a code. Deals look different depending on who is watching. The public might see a headline, "Big firm buys local practice," and miss the moments of quiet negotiation and the awkward echoes of childhood that threaded through the weeks. The private would see schedules and signatures, and the slow work of integrating practices. For me, both matters mattered. I left the office that evening to prepare for the next day, a Saturday that, in the end, was not the only meeting we had. There would be the retirement party to plan, client notices to draft, the HR processes to finalize for the associates. There would also be dinner with my father, arranged by Marcus as a kind of peace offering disguised as logistics. When I walked into that small Italian restaurant, the room hummed with normality, clinking glassware, muted laughter. My father stood as I entered, and for a beat the years slid away. We exchanged formalities. Then we sat, ordered, and talked about small things, about the city's weather and the change of seasons, before the conversation folded back into the why of the deal. He reached across the table once, not in theatrics, but in a real attempt at connection, and said something clumsy about pride. I didn't know how to receive it entirely. I only know that I leaned into the part of the woman I had become, steady, precise, and not willing to allow sentiment to override process. As we ordered dessert, a thought moved through me with the slow certainty of a tide. Proving someone wrong is a hollow victory unless you can also prove you've done right by those who trusted you to steward more than a balance sheet. The firm would come with its complexities. The people I would now be responsible for had names and families and mortgage payments and ambitions that extended beyond the headlines. That is what had, from the beginning, made me press for an acquisition rather than a partnership. It did not feel like closure. It felt like the opening of a new, fraught chapter. The moment I left the restaurant, my phone buzzed. It was Rebecca. Draft of the press release attached. Legal teams on standby. HR ready to begin the integration checklist. I tapped a response. Let's proceed. Keep the language about dignity and transition front and center. Then I paused and added, because sometimes we need to say the obvious aloud, and make sure the associates get their incentivized retention packages on day one post-close. There are decisions that ask you to be both a child and a CEO in the same day. I had been both. The week ahead would be dense, red lines, client consents, partner signatures, and more conversations with a man who had been part father and part obstacle for most of my life. I was ready in the way a seasoned lawyer is ready, with backup plans, with contingency clauses, with the knowledge that ambiguity could be managed through clear commitments. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at the river as it cut through the city's grid. On the table beside me, the legal pad with its circled May 28th was folded. The $15 million figure stared back like a promise I had made not just to myself, but to a collection of clients and colleagues who were counting on stability. The work was beginning in earnest. It would not be easy, and it would not be simple. There would be moments of friction, contracts to negotiate, reputations to reckon with, and awkward public acknowledgments from men who had trouble admitting fault. There would also be opportunities to build a practice that honored clients, to promote young lawyers who had earned a seat at the table, and to model a stewardship that respected legacy while building for the future. I closed my eyes for a beat and let the thought that had guided me these past months settle in. Vindication, if it comes, must be measured by what you do with it. I had arranged for the mechanics. I had drafted the offer and circled a date. I had asked for the promotions and the advisory terms. The rest would be formalities if all parties kept to their word. When my phone buzzed again, it was a message from my father. "We'll meet Monday. Thank you." No flourish, no apology repackaged as rhetoric, just a line that carried the weight of acknowledgement. I typed back, "We'll proceed with care." The next few days would be full of signatures, of calls with client relationship partners, and of coordination across multiple teams. They would also contain the private maintenance of a newly precarious relationship. I thought of the backyard again, not as a place of judgment, but as a place that had formed me. And before I slept that night, I wrote one more note on the legal pad. This is for the clients first. Everything else follows. The morning of May 28th arrives like any other that a lawyer learns to accept. Early, precise, full of incremental checklists. At 7:12 a.m., the closing room request pings my calendar, an internal reservation confirming the external counsel's video link and the bank's wire instructions. The city outside my window is already a smear of commuters and delivery trucks, but inside our conference room, the light is quiet, as if the world is allowing us a moment of proper attention. We had rehearsed the script for weeks, client consent letters in place, retention packages signed by the key associates, a clear advisory schedule for the senior partners from Brennan Associates. The $15 million figure had been negotiated in red lines and phone calls. It sat on paper with the blunt authority of an agreed number. The 60-day close target had shrunk the usual dithering of mid-market deals into a disciplined march. We had balanced legal language against the softer promises we'd made, promises about dignity, career trajectories, and continuity. Rebecca arrives before me, as she always does when the day demands someone vigilant. She carries a slim binder of documents that could have been mistaken for a small, sacred text. Signed consents. The list of clients with introductions mapped to specific practice heads. The 3 promotion letters folded like small flags. I glance at them as if looking at a family album. Only this album comes with indemnities and performance metrics. The names of the 3 associates we had committed to promote, Elena Park, Jamal Ortiz, and Priya Shah, are printed in bold on my copy. I had chosen those names at the committee because their files reflected not personality alone, but a pattern of responsibility and client-facing competence that made the promotions defensible by any metric. When the call begins, it is all efficient civility. The external counsel for Brennan Associates, who has been a steady presence through the red lines, speaks first and confirms the mechanical items: delivery of consideration, the routing of client consent responses, updates to the firm roster. The documents slide back and forth in encrypted packets and passworded emails. At one point, my father, who has elected to attend the virtual closing, though he is technically retired at this point, appears on the corner of my screen. His frame is small, his background a bookshelf that still smells faintly of lemon oil. He nods once, the economy of a man who once ran a firm with far fewer emails and far more direct speech. We sign. There is no dramatic gavel, no cinematic flourish. Thomas Mitchell makes a brief professional remark about the opportunities ahead. Marcus gives a curt smile, comfortable on screen the way he was never comfortable in our childhood backyard, and my father, when he speaks, keeps his sentence short. "Thank you," he says, to no one in particular and to everyone at once. The wire is confirmed, signatures are verified, and our communications team pivots to the press release they have kept deliberately neutral, respectful of legacy, firm about the structural changes. We will honor Brennan Associates' history while integrating operations and communicating the career pathways we promised. The retirement party that night is small in scale and large in feeling. We booked a room with warm lighting rather than a boardroom-style hall. There is an attempt to make the night less about the deal and more about the people who had spent decades in courtrooms and client dinners. Colleagues mingle, laughter is a little guarded, and at the center of the room a framed photograph of the firm's early years. Men and women older than most of the associates in attendance, sits like an artifact. My father is given a microphone for a brief speech that is more about gratitude than reflection. He thanks clients, staff, and, in a moment of surprising clarity, names the associates by their years of service. It's not an apology. Apologies are complicated things, but it is acknowledgement. He recognizes that the firm has been a collective effort and that he did not build it alone. When I stand to speak, I do what I have always done in public. I ground rhetoric in specific commitments. I thank the senior partners for entrusting us with their legacy. I list the structural elements that will shape the transition. The 2-year advisory timetable we had negotiated, the client handoff milestones, the retention bonuses that are effective upon close. I name the 3 associates and explain, in practical terms, what each promotion means. Expanded client responsibilities for Elena, leadership of the litigation docket for Jamal, and a new role in business development for Priya. The applause is genuine and brisk. There is relief in the room that feels almost like permission, an acknowledgement that this strange blend of business and family has a path forward. After the party, for the first time in weeks, I allow myself a long exhale. The transaction mechanics that had dominated my life ease into an operational hum. Yet, as the initial shock of completion fades, the more complicated work begins. Integration is not an event. It is a season. Our teams begin the hard work of merging practice management systems, aligning billing protocols, and creating a cultural orientation that is meant to respect the old ways while introducing new efficiencies. We set weekly check-ins with the senior partners from Brennan Associates, calls with agendas, deliverables, and client introduction plans. We designate a transition lead in Chicago who will be the day-to-day steward of the integration. Within a month, the honeymoon phase reveals its first tensions. There are small things, a disagreement over a file numbering system, a misunderstanding about associate staffing on a high-stakes matter, that flare into heated emails. Some of our existing partners worry about the optics of promoting 3 people who had been with a different firm. Some of Brennan's long-standing clients express unease at the change in familiar faces on their matters. Those are the moments where the promise we made, to clients and to the associates, gets tested. We respond with governance, an integration committee with clear KPIs, client-focused communications that include specific introduction timelines, and regular town halls where associates can raise concerns openly. At home, the work of reconciliation proceeds on a different, quieter timeline. There is no cinematic montage where decades evaporate into understanding. Instead, there are dinners that begin awkwardly and grow less so. We begin with a Tuesday at my brother's apartment, where the main course is small talk, and the dessert is more honest. Marcus is the bridge in many ways, his texts nudging us to be reasonable, his offhand remarks reminding us of shared history. He has his own complicated relationship to the firm and to our father. He is neither wholly aligned with my choices, nor wholly opposed. He exists as a sibling who understands pattern and continuity in ways I sometimes do not. Our conversations with my father remain halting. He tells stories, the ones about trials where he thought he had made brilliant arguments, the ones about losing a case and learning humility only afterward. He offers, in private, small admissions that carry more weight because they are not designed to comfort me. He admits, one evening, that there were times he feared my independence the way some men fear losing a grip on a thing they had defined as theirs. "I wanted you at my table," he says, "but I wanted to know what you would say when I wasn't in the room." It is not an apology framed as such. It is a confession that allows for a reconfiguration of the relationship. I do not sweep aside the years of casual belittlement. Those sentences, "You'll never be a real lawyer," left marks that took time to heal. But what I am learning is that restoration is not a single act. It is a steady accumulation of small mutual recognitions. I will show you, in meetings, that I hold your clients with care. You will show me, in private, that you can admit when you were wrong. We learn to measure forgiveness not by the absence of memory, but by the presence of changed behavior. In that sense, the acquisition functions as both a professional strategy and an extended negotiation about how we will relate to one another going forward. The months after the close bring forward a spate of measurable outcomes. Elena, Jamal, and Priya take on expanded responsibilities. Elena leads an arbitration where she confounds expectations and earns client praise. Jamal secures a favorable discovery schedule that the client highlights in a testimonial. Priya brings a new nonprofit client whose work dovetails with our pro bono commitments. These early wins are small, but they matter. They vindicate the decision to promote from within and signal to associates that the promises we made were not rhetoric, but real. Retention rates among former Brennan Associates remain high over the next year, which, from a business perspective, validates the strategy of acquisition versus partnership, control of integration, clear career progression, and immediate presence in Chicago. At the same time, there are cultural frictions we cannot paper over with processes alone. Some long-tenured partners from Brennan and Associates chafe at billing practices that they find intrusive. Our partners must learn to explain why certain systems are necessary for cross-firm collaboration. We convene training sessions, and I chair several, which feel like running a classroom in which I am both teacher and student. I absorb feedback, some of it blunt, and I answer with practical changes. Adjusted billing templates, shared paralegal support, and a mentorship framework that pairs junior lawyers across the merged firm. One particular day I remember because it crystallized the complexity of what we had done. A prominent client, someone who had been loyal to Brennan for years, called, worried about the continuity of counsel on a sensitive matter. They feared loss of institutional knowledge. I arranged a call, convened our subject matter lead, and personally walked the client through the continuity plan, the advisory schedule for senior partners, a timeline for introductions, and commitment milestones where the client could evaluate progress. By the end of the call, the client expressed guarded appreciation. It was not the kind of triumphal conversion we get in novels. It was a pragmatic slowing of anxiety. But it was enough. It reminded me why the acquisition was the right choice: to protect relationships that clients themselves prized. In the quiet of my hotel room during a Midwestern court calendar, I sometimes replay the narrative of the envelope at 9:23 a.m. I think about how an administrative decision to use my mother's maiden name became a life pattern, how choosing Morrison as my professional signature was both a shield and an identity. I think about the years that shaped me, the backyard verdicts, the law school nights, the long hours at Cravath where competence was the only language that masked vulnerability. That choice, Morrison, allowed me to build an institutional voice that could evaluate my father's firm without immediate nepotistic suspicion. It also allowed me to keep, in my head, the rules by which I would later hold the acquisition accountable. The interpersonal texture of our relationship with my father changes, but not in a linear way. There are evenings where conversation flows and laughter arrives at the table naturally. There are longer stretches of silence where neither of us knows exactly how to bridge the space between past and present. Once, when he stayed with us overnight after a late event, he wandered into my office at 4 a.m. and sat at the edge of the desk. He picked up a paper my mother had once written, notes about a trial she followed, and sighed. "She would have loved this," he said. In that small admission, he placed my mother back at the center of a life that had been full of competing loyalties. We talked until dawn about ordinary things, gardeners we had used, the way certain clients liked their coffee, and I felt for a moment that we had created a new grammar for being in the same room. There are decisions I regret. I could have raised my voice at some points, could have demanded more public contrition than I allowed. I could have refused the first handshake offered in the boardroom. I did none of those things. Instead, I chose a path that kept the primary beneficiaries, clients and associates, in focus. I held on to the conviction that business logic could be a tool for humane outcomes. That conviction has been tested, and in many ways it has held. The promotions were real. The advisory terms were followed with discipline. The commitments to client continuity were not empty phrases. In private, my father and I make progress that is incremental and sober. He begins to call more often, not to ask about deals, but to exchange small observations. He sends me an article about judicial interpretations of a practice area he thinks I will find interesting. I send him articles in return, ones about leadership studies and modern governance. Our conversations rarely touch the sharp edges of the past the way they used to. Instead, they are built of shared professional interests and an awkward, growing tenderness. I am careful not to conflate reconciled public footing with personal absolution. Forgiveness in our household is not a single stroke. It is a series of returns, dinners, phone calls, invitations to attend court hearings, where we watch each other do the work that has defined us. We argue occasionally. Old patterns surface when disagreements about billing or client management flare up. But those are not failures so much as normal friction in any long-standing relationship that has been redefined. A year after the close, at a modest firm anniversary luncheon, my father stands and raises his glass. He is quieter now, his voice carrying the lines of someone who spent decades listening to others speak. He says, "We built something, maybe in ways different from how I imagined. It matters that it continues." He looks at me in a way that takes a measure of the years between us without pretending they weren't there. I raise my glass in return. The crowd applauds politely. The applause feels like a permission to keep moving forward, not a conclusion. When people ask me, colleagues, young lawyers, and sometimes reporters, what motivated the acquisition, I answer in the language I had used in committee and in the boardroom: to protect clients, to retain talented associates, to accelerate our entry into a strategic market in a cost-effective way. I say it calmly because it is true. I also do not hide the personal context because transparency matters. I tell them that my family history influenced the texture of negotiations, but that it did not drive the decision. That distinction is important. Business rationale must be airtight when family is involved. Otherwise, the whole structure risks collapsing under suspicion. We designed firewalls and governance to prevent that. I explain this not as moral virtue, but as professional necessity. There is a strange satisfaction in being able, finally, to look a former prediction, "You'll never be a real lawyer," in the eye, and say that the measure of being a real lawyer is not a line of inheritance, but a record of stewardship. Being a real lawyer, to me, means holding clients' interests above one's pride, creating career paths for junior colleagues, and making hard, sometimes tender choices that preserve institutions rather than simply winning arguments. I did not buy my father's firm to prove him wrong in the petty sense. I bought it because the business case aligned with the ethical obligations we owe to clients and to young lawyers trying to build careers. Still, the personal calculus cannot be disentangled completely. The acquisition carried costs that had nothing to do with balance sheets, hours spent on reconciliation that I might have used elsewhere, dinners where we skirted certain subjects, and the subtle erosion of some childhood illusions about paternal approval. Those are the prices of growth. They are not negligible. They are, in their way, the reason the victory feels bittersweet. As I think about the headline that will inevitably land at the intersection of family and profession, Dad said you'd never be a real lawyer. Then my firm bought his. I understand why the story resonates. It is, on its face, dramatic. But the truth underneath is more complex. It is about stewardship, hard choices, and the imperfect texture of human relationships. That complexity is what I want people to take away. If you are watching because you have lived something similar, because your family has been a constant commentary on your career, or because you have had to make a choice between personal satisfaction and professional responsibility, know this: There is no tidy victory. There is only the accumulation of small right choices. If you protect clients, honor colleagues, and keep your processes clean, you will build something that matters beyond the satisfaction of being proven right. The work continues. The integration team still meets every other Tuesday. Elena, Jamal, and Priya continue to impress and to challenge us with constructive critiques. My father and I trade articles more than we used to. We keep the dinners coming. We show up for court hearings when the other is assigned a matter. There are no cinematic reconciliations, only the slow, faithful work of being in the same life together on different terms. If anything, the story of the envelope at 9:23 a.m. taught me how crucial it is to let business reasoning guide personal decisions where possible, and to let human compassion govern the parts that business cannot fix. The acquisition was, in the end, a set of choices designed to preserve what matters: client relationships, associate careers, and the reputational capital that a local firm carries. The fact that my father's name was on the door complicated the emotional landscape, but it did not alter the fundamental calculus. So when someone asks me now whether I ever feel like I got the last word, I shake my head. Vindication, if it arrives at all, is quieter than that. It arrives in the steady maintenance of promises, in the trajectory of junior lawyers who now have clearer paths, and in a relationship that, while imperfect, has room to breathe. I did not become a real lawyer because of a headline. I became one by doing the work that made others' careers possible. If this resonates with you, if you have a family story, a career crossroad, or a professional dilemma that asks for both head and heart, I'd encourage you to reflect on the priorities that matter most in your context. Protect the people who depend on you. Use clear process. Keep your promises. And when the personal and the professional collide, let the business logic you respect be the scaffolding for humane outcomes. If you want more stories like this, about leadership, about complex family dynamics in business, about the things we choose to protect, subscribe and share this with someone who needs the reminder that doing the right thing is often complicated and always worth the effort.